It's really a joy to be with you all. So we're going to jump into some questions. And so Jenny, Carla, Jarrett, feel free to just jump in as you guys feel ready and are comfortable. So first question. Jenny, you had shared the importance of viewing the issues of immigration and refugees from a biblical perspective first and foremost, as followers of Jesus. So often, research shows that only 12% of evangelical Christians have their views about immigration and refugees formed by the scriptures. And so can you share an example of a position or view that a Christian can have about immigration that is faithful to scripture and socially, economically, nationally responsible? So kind of a blending, because they're not mutually exclusive, so how can we see those together?
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful question. So thanks to whoever sent in that question. So I oftentimes think that there's competing narratives in the immigration conversation. There's, you have to secure the border and crack down on, unauthorized immigration. And the other is, you have to show compassion to immigrants. And as Ree was mentioning, I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think we can actually do both. And so I think the main principles and values that we have is we have to recognize the needs of our economy and the needs of families to be together and really have an immigration system that reflects those needs, right? And so when I mentioned before that when Congress passed our immigration laws, it was to allow people who want to be with family or to work blood, sweat, and tears to be able to come here, I think those are still values that we need to have in our current immigration system. But when you look at our immigration laws today, it is actually not responsive to those needs. And so when you look at the laws today of how many people are allowed to come into our country to work, it is very, very, very limited. And so there's only several thousand visas available for low-skilled immigrants to come here and work, where the majority of those who come in to work in our country have to be highly skilled. So you have to have money to invest into the economy, you have to be a software engineer, and that's where it's weighted towards. And so I would say that, generally speaking, we have to close the back door, open the front door, and allow those who are here without documentation to earn legalization. And so, again, I would emphasize the fact that I think, we do need border security. I think we should continue to support our border agents and others that are doing hard work along the border to make sure that our border is secure. But at the same time, if we're going to do that, we have to have legal avenues through which immigrants can actually come. And so when we don't have those legal avenues, it makes the job of our Border Patrol agents and others that are trying to enforce the law very, very, very hard. And so close the back door, open the front door, and then allow those who are here without authorization to earn legalization in some way. And so I think that's somewhat of a balanced way, not just to say we need to open the borders, but then I think we need to secure the border, but we also need to have a more flexible immigration system, and then recognize the fact that for many millions of people that are here without authorization, that there has to be a way within our current laws right now to allow these individuals to correct their status, but right now there's no way for them to do that.
That's really helpful, yeah. Even just that little phrase, open the front door, close the back door, that's just a helpful way to even kind of remember how you're framing that. Thank you. Jarrett, Carla, anything you guys would add to that?
I can jump in on that one a little bit too, and I think even just the video and the part that I was sharing here at the end just kind of demonstrates that the economic impact of immigration is a positive, especially if we're talking about neighborhoods like mine. And this is not just our neighborhood, but it's across the country. Cities are benefiting from immigrants who are coming in. And so a lot of times, those immigrants currently, there may be a portion of those who are undocumented or who may be dreamers and who are here and working legally with DACA. So one specific example would be a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients, which would allow them to be able to stay here, work, continue to contribute. It's not only compassionate and right from a moral standpoint, but the impact that dreamers are making on our country right now is tremendous. And to lose them would be a serious detriment to our economy. So like Jenny was saying, I think the two aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, in most cases, compassionate biblical response on immigration issues actually coincides with what is positive for our country from an economic standpoint as well. That's
really well said. Okay, so question 2. Immigration is a politically divisive hot button. News alert. I don't know if you knew that. So, in the midst of all of the heated words, how do you daily maintain your hope so that you can keep loving and advocating for your immigrant neighbors? Carla? Oh, I saw the hand go up.
Would you mind repeating the question?
Yes. So immigration is a politically divisive hot button subject. In the midst of all the heated words, how do you daily maintain your hope so that you can keep loving and advocating for your immigrant neighbors?
You know, Reed, earlier you and I were having a conversation and you mentioned the power that proximity has. And it's true. Sometimes we look at things on the news, maybe on media, we disregard it because it doesn't really affect us until you see it happening to someone that's really close to you, and then it really truly affects you. And so the way to continue to be thinking about these issues, not in a political way, but just in a compassionate, biblical way, is proximity. Get closer to those that are coming in, the immigrants, refugees, get to know them, build a relationship with them. Then you get to really understand their situation, the reasons why they came here, the challenges that they have to face, assimilating to the new culture, language barriers, and so I would say proximity.
That's really well said. I've heard it said too that when an issue continues to be an issue and not you're dealing with real people, then that's what actually makes it a problem. Like if we're talking about this as though it's just an issue and not real human beings with stories attached to them, that's very much how it's easy to lose hope and continuing on in that. So well said.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would just add too is that I think, being in a community with you all right here in Kansas, where I'm talking with several of you about your perspectives and stories and your passions, that's actually what really gives me hope. Because I think, when you look at the broader evangelical community in the United States, when you look at polls after polls, the research actually shows that most people think, most white Christians actually believe that immigrants are a burden. And when you look at a lot of the polling, you'll find that white Christians, more than any other category of Black Protestants, white Catholics, non-religious people, are the most likely to think that immigrants are a burden, or that they threaten American values and customs. And so when I go to communities like this, where I've talked to so many of you about how what you're doing with your immigrant neighbors and what you're doing to minister to Algerians and others, like that is what gives me hope, because I think this community right here is running counter to the broader narrative within the broader community that Christians like hate immigrants, and I don't believe that bears out when I travel to places like this and really meet with all of you. And so I would say keep doing the things that you're doing to get plugged into local opportunities. As Carla was saying, proximity is really what changes the narrative. And as you get to know your immigrant neighbors, I believe that is what should be the foundation of your engagement. And so all of you, I would say, encourage me.
Great. Yeah. Anything else you'd add, Jared?
Yeah, I would just say both of what they said, absolutely. I find, at Mission Adelante, we hear the noise out there when negative things are said and the challenges of the situation, but we also have volunteers coming from across the city to serve and to teach English and to work with kids. And so there is a sense that the church is responding, even though not all of the church is responding. And so there's definitely hope in that. And then what Carla was saying too, just in the most discouraging times with regard to immigration policy and the tone around immigration, being with my community, just being together and just knowing, we can suffer together in some ways, we can lament together some of the things that are happening around us, but we find the sense of joy and consolation in the comfort that our community offers to one another.
That's great. So this is kind of related to this, and we saw this in the wonderful documentary is it Overlooked? That's the name of yeah, so that was beautiful. What would you say is the biggest misconception people have about immigrants? And so, there's many we could mention, but what's one of the biggest misconceptions? And I'll maybe add to that, maybe uniquely that Christians or the church has of immigrants. If you want to add that nuance, you can. But what's one of the biggest misconceptions people have of immigrants?
I could name a list of them.
Let me count the ways.
I think that immigrants are a burden. We've been talking about that one, that they take more than they give, that they don't pay taxes, that they are breaking the law, like undocumented immigrants are breaking the law on purpose because they don't have respect for the law. That's a misconception. Almost everybody I know, if there was a pathway for them to gain legal status, they would absolutely walk it. There just is no line. There is no pathway for that. So those are just a handful that come up right off the bat when I think about it. And a lot of the misconceptions have to do with either false information that we're receiving, or just a lack of education on what our immigration policies really are. Just the belief that somebody could gain legal status if they just did it the right way at this point. That's something that most people think is true. But for most categories of people, even if they've been living here for a long time, there just isn't even a way to do that. And so that's just a common misconception. I'm sure there's many others that you guys can think of.
I agree, Jared. I think the biggest misconception that I've heard is that it's very easy to obtain legal status, when in fact it's very difficult, and oftentimes it isn't as easy as it seems. Many times I've heard as well that get in line, it'll be quicker than you think, but it's not really. I remember when my grandma got her visa to be able to visit us. It took a while for her to be able to get it. In fact, we had already been living here for nearly 10 years before I got to see my grandma. And that's how long it took for her to get her visa. She'd been trying ever since for us to see each other one again. And it took that long for her to get that visa. So yes, it's not easy. It's not just get in line and here's your legal citizenship. It's a lot harder than that.
Yeah, and oftentimes when I talk about the history of immigration in the United States, I do that because I think we sometimes think that our family or our ancestors were morally superior because they didn't break any laws to come here. And again, I think when we look at the previous generations of immigrants, they operated under a completely different system, and yet they fled the same exact circumstances as the immigrants of today are coming. And so yes, we live in a society of laws and structures and policies, but to think that the immigrants of today somehow are morally inferior because they're skirting the system. If our ancestors try to come into the current system, most of them would not qualify to come because they're fleeing poverty, they didn't qualify, they didn't have high skills, they didn't have money. And so I just think it's important to remember that, because when many of us go to Central America, Mexico, or overseas and do missions work, and that's really important work. And yet when these individuals are coming into our community, sometimes I think we can draw a red line in the sand and say, well, you're not doing it the right way, or you shouldn't come here. And I think this reflexive, rule of law impulse that a lot of us have as Christians is I think rule of law is important, but it's not the ultimate. And I say that because in a lot of places around the world, missionaries skirt the law because they want to transfer Bibles in and smuggle them in to spread the gospel. And we wouldn't think, well, that's breaking the law because they're doing God's work. But yeah, I think we use that same reasoning to morally castigate individuals that may have broken immigration laws. But oftentimes their value set to provide for their families and to feed their families was superior than an old immigration law in the United States. And so I just think it's important that we have that kind of framework as we think about immigration today. And I think that'll help us as we even think about ways to reform our current immigration laws.
Yeah, that historical perspective, we tend to think that immigrants back then are different from immigrants now, but that's really helpful, Jenny. Thank you. Okay, so this is a question that's kind of been asked in a couple ways. So uniquely, when we planned this event, I think it was even before COVID, and so we did not know, but God in His providence knew that this would take place during this great refugee resettlement in Afghanistan. And so there's questions about how can we help Afghan refugees in Kansas City, and one maybe more specific question that came through was, how do churches and governments currently work together, or how does the church and government work together to support refugee settlement? How can churches get involved in that process? And so maybe that's a broad question, or maybe more specific to Kansas City, that I would love to hear from you guys.
Do you want to give the local perspective?
Well, maybe you could talk about it from a broad perspective, and then I know
Yeah.
we have Refuge KC coming up to talk very specifically about that here in just a little bit.
Yeah, so right after our panel, there'll be someone who can talk to you directly about ways to get involved locally to help the Afghans that are coming in, because again, I do think this is a huge opportunity for the church to step up and really welcome a lot of Afghans that we're seeing really desperate to leave Afghanistan and are coming right here to Kansas City. And so I would say that I think on a broader level, plugging into the organization that's going to speak afterwards, just volunteering with them is going to be important to actually have a relationship with some Afghan families that are coming here. I would also say on a national basis that there continues to be the need for advocacy. And so if you've never contacted your senators from Kansas or Missouri to tell them that you support Afghans coming in, that's a huge opportunity to do so. Because many of the Afghans that have come in actually came in on a very temporary immigration status called parole. And so when the US government only had 2 weeks to evacuate thousands of people that were vulnerable, the only way they could do it was by granting parole to these Afghans. And so the Afghans are here, and they're in this parole status, which actually expires after 2 years. And so what we've been advocating for the US government and Congress to pass is a law that would allow Afghan parolees to actually be able to get a green card once they're here. It doesn't mean they skirt the vetting system, because they have to be vetted in order to get a green card. But what it does mean is that the parolees, the Afghan parolees, don't have to apply for asylum, which right now is significantly backlogged. And so we've been actually trying to get a Republican co-sponsor to actually co-sponsor what's called the Afghan Adjustment Act that would allow Afghan parolees to be able to adjust status here. And we have yet to find one. Senator Ernst from Iowa is actually likely going to be maybe a Republican co-sponsor, but we would love for Senator Moran and others to actually join us to help support these Afghans. So if you have an opportunity to talk to your senator or to weigh in, please do express support for the Afghan Adjustment Act so that Afghan parolees can adjust status. If you know anything about Cubans that come into the United States, if you're Cuban and you come into the US, you can automatically basically get a green card. That's what's called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And so again, we're asking for the same kind of considerations for Afghans that have come so that they don't have to apply for asylum and can just get a green card since they're here.
The only thing I'll add at this point on a local level, we are receiving Afghan refugees, particularly on the Missouri side of Kansas City. There's a few hundred people who've come. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but the biggest need I think right now is housing. But there are also a lot of other needs, adopting families and such. And I do believe Refuge KC is going to talk more specifically about how to get involved with that in just a few minutes.
As well as Catholic Charities, that's another organization we'll share a little bit of detail on as we continue, yeah. Okay, so here's a question that I think, as it pertains to, Jenny, you shared so beautifully, and one of my just personal takeaways was the language you were so intentional in saying is that this is an opportunity for the church to not simply share the gospel, but to receive the gospel. That there is something about seeing the beauty and the fullness of the good news of Christ through the eyes of immigrant neighbors that tells us something of the beauty of Christ that we can't see when we remain in our kind of homogenous communities. And that's not to shame us, but it's, anyway, I could preach. But let me ask this question. How do we personally love and serve refugees with the hope that they might know Jesus without making it look like we have ulterior motives? And so, yes, there is a desire for people from all places to know Jesus and to be known by him. How do we do so genuinely without it feeling disingenuous and that we have ulterior motives?
Yeah. So I would say two things, and this is what I learned just from getting to know Syrian refugees in Baltimore, where I live. The first is that, as much as we're sharing about our communities and cultures, it's just as important for us to ask questions about their beliefs and their cultures. And so whenever we're entering into a relationship, it's not just about us telling them everything we know. Are we learners in the process? Are we trying to be curious and seek as much information from them as we want to share with them? And so if your Afghan neighbor and Afghan refugee family are Muslim, ask them what it means to be Muslim, ask them what it means to believe in the Quran. Be curious about it. It doesn't mean just because you're asking questions that you're going to become Muslim or anything, but ask them what it's like, because it's when you start to understand them and their belief systems and their cultures that I think that's what helps establish a friendship. So there's mutuality there, right? Where you're curious and you're learning about their customs and beliefs as much as you're sharing about yours. And the second thing I would say in terms of, in addition to just being curious and asking questions, is really to have open invitations. And so I think a lot of times for us in the church, it is important to invite friends and newcomers to church events and to our homes for dinners. And I think having open invitations is so important. And so as your church is having an event, or if your community is having a party, or you just want to host an Afghan family in your house, always have that open invitation there, because that family can easily say no, perhaps, but also having that open invite, they can easily say yes too. And so I think making sure that you're constantly inviting and giving them the discretion to say no with what they're comfortable with, I think that's always important as well.
Carla, I'm going to put you on the spot. I want to hear from you.
I agree, Jenny. I'd also say that my time spent serving at Mission Adelante, I'd say that some of the most beautiful moments have been when I truly get to know people and know their culture and get to know more about them, but also sometimes when they come to learn who Jesus is, and through our work sharing the gospel, I think sometimes it's so beautiful because each of our own experiences with Jesus is very unique. And so seeing how my refugee neighbor or my immigrant neighbor gets to experience the gospel, gets to learn about Jesus, knows Jesus for the first time, it's such a new way for me to think about my faith. It renews my faith. It makes me think about just different things that I wouldn't have thought about. It's a new perspective. But I would also say, even, for example, at Mission Adelante, we have a lot of Cuban people that are there with us at our church. And so getting to know them and getting to know how they met Jesus also impacts my faith. And so I go back to that proximity thing, guys, that getting to know people and getting to know their experience, even if they're, like Jenny said, even if they're not Christian, getting to know them has experienced and changed my own faith too.
Yeah, I'll just add just one thought about the idea of loving and evangelism and how those two things interact. And really the question is love a strategy of evangelism, or is evangelism an aspect of what love looks like? And I think the answer to that question really will determine a lot about how people receive that, and also demonstrates a lot about our own motive. And I would just say, evangelism should flow out of a loving heart towards others. Love shouldn't be a strategy of evangelism. And if it is, then that will be smelled, that will be detected pretty easily, and it will turn people off, and I think it would be somewhat offensive. So as we engage with people from other places and we're thinking about sharing the gospel, we just have to remember that we have to get the motive right first. And that motive of love has got to be primary. It's got to be there over and above everything else. Evangelism without love is unloving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. All right, I think we have time for one more question, and so this is a version of this question has come through from several people, and actually really quick, I want to say just recommend a potentially even resource. Jenny, you mentioned something about getting to know the cultures and even religious backgrounds of your neighbors. If you're interested in kind of the theology of this, there's a great book called Saved by Faith and Hospitality by Josh Jipp, Jipp. And so beautiful book in laying out the hospitable nature of God, biblically speaking, and then what that looks like and the implications that has for how we uniquely engage in relationships with the religious and cultural other. Phenomenal book, Saved by Faith and Hospitality. Kind of a controversial title, but a beautiful book I would highly recommend. So last question here, as I get my phone on. A lot of people have asked this, so how can we address and respond to this seemingly growing sense of xenophobia, the fear of the other, the fear of the stranger? How can we address and respond to this seemingly growing sense of xenophobia in our country? What tips or tools would you give so that we can combat this fear that people have, and maybe that we have as well?
Proximity. Carla said it already, I think, that just the opportunity to, go make a friend who's from a different place, has maybe a different faith, a different culture, and just enjoy friendship together. And so, if we're trying to combat that, I think inviting people into that process to do that together.
Yeah, definitely. Proximity, getting to know one another. And you'll find oftentimes you might say, hey, this person and I don't have anything in common. And then you'll figure out, hey, we have a ton of things in common. And finding out that friendship, getting to know them better, getting to know more about their culture, you've already done a lot to get to know them. And so proximity.
Yeah. I think this question is so relevant because maybe some of us are recalling conversations we had over Christmas or at the dinner table and Thanksgiving where, we're like, oh gosh, my relative who's like railing against immigrants and foreigners. Or what was so interesting about this past year in 2021 was that I think with Afghanistan, it really coalesced this like broad spectrum of opinion that really was unprecedented, because I think from both conservatives and liberals and across the spectrum, everyone was saying we have to welcome these Afghan refugees. And so I think that really was a foundation from which you can start having some of these conversations. And I think if your relative or friend is a follower of Jesus, I would always go back to that, because I think a lot of people who are afraid of foreigners or afraid of Muslims or others really, I think, are afraid because they've never met a Muslim before. And so if you don't have that relationship informing your perspective, and all you're hearing from someone else, on the news or somewhere else is, they're trying to establish Sharia law and all these things that are probably not true, nothing is really going to combat that fear unless that person really gets to know someone who is of that, person, like that person they fear. And so, again, I do think, going back to scriptures and reminding people of the stories of people you've met, I think that can change that person's perspective. You can give them a little bookmark that says, how much the Bible says about immigrants or immigration. Share a book with them and challenge them to read more from a different perspective. There's a lot of resources out there, but I think always pivoting back to stories is always so important, because, again, I think there's nothing that's going to counter fear as much as a personal story, because they are not going to be able to argue with your experience of being friends with someone that they fear. So, yeah.
Well said. Well said. Carl and I were mentioning this earlier, but I've heard it said that distance breeds suspicion, proximity breeds empathy, and that's true relationally, geographically, and that is. It's a powerful word. It's a powerful word and a relevant one. So, will you join me in just saying thank you to our panelists?